All right, my clock says it's 11:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name's Amy Donahue. I am a genetic counselor who works and lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So hi from Wisconsin. I got connected to y'all because I once upon a time spent a few years in the DC area at the National Institutes of Health and the National Library of Medicine, doing a library fellowship. And because of that, I met a long-time volunteer and otherwise connected person with the FDIA, Christian Minter, and she now works as a librarian. And because of that connection, she asked me to talk about something that I really like talking about, which is genetics. So I've got a few slides I'm going to share with you all today. So let's go ahead and first, I do always like to start by just talking about or giving an overview of what I'm going to talk about, just so there's no major surprises. So I'm going to talk about some various genetic terms and define a couple things for us all. And then I'm going to touch on a few areas of genetics, including evolution, human traits, and then genetics on our health, which is where genetic counselors play a major role. And I will give you some resources. And there might be some time for questions actually at the end if there are any pressing things. So, and if anything does come up as I'm talking, I think feel free to put it into the chat and I will attempt to answer as I can, and happy to pause whenever you do have questions. And by the end of this talk, I have a few things that maybe you'll be able to do some objectives. If you've had teachers who have objectives before, maybe you've seen these, but just to lay them out there, hopefully by the end of this, you might be able to define the word gene. Maybe you can briefly explain evolution. Name 2 or 3 human traits. Maybe explain a little bit, at least one type of inheritance pattern. Maybe you already know how to do that. And then tell someone what a genetic counselor does. So that's a lot. I'm going to try to fit in just those high level things, no quizzes. If you don't come away with any of these things, I'm just happy to be here with you. And yeah, thanks for being with me. So to start, the first thing I'd like to do is make sure that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. The word gene has some different meanings and can be understandably confusing. So I'm not talking about denim, and I'm also not talking about the actor who played Willy Wonka in the old version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So not talking about Gene Wilder. Instead, we are going to be talking about the genes that are in our DNA. So what is a gene? Let's define this biological concept. So these are the dictionary definitions for gene if you type the word into Google. The first is that it's a unit of heredity which is transferred from parent to child and that determines some characteristic of the child. A more sciencey definition that also pops up is that a gene is a distinct sequence of nucleotides. And then it continues with much more scientific, several words in there that I would not expect anyone to necessarily know. But it does get at what the definition of a gene actually is. But I think that unit of heredity is a pretty standard way of thinking about a gene. But if you want to take a second, because we all have different words to describe the same thing, maybe talk to the person who's sitting with you. If you have other people in the room, parents, siblings, friends, feel free to define gene. And if you want to share in the chat with us how you define gene, that would also be great. So I'll give you a second to do that. And I do also, you can continue to talk or chat or whatever, but I'm also going to define or talk a little bit about the picture on this slide, which shows how, it's a picture of a gene, shows how a gene is actually an individual piece of the squiggly stuff that comes out of that object called a chromosome. I'm not going to define chromosome. I'm really focused on that word gene today, but that squiggly stuff is the chemical code called DNA. So if you've heard that word DNA, it's a chemical that is a code. It's a string of letters. So how I like to think of genes is as a single recipe in a cookbook. So I can use that analogy. I use it with my patients. I use it with doctors. It's just an easy, understandable analogy to think of a gene as a single recipe that's inside a cookbook. So if the gene is the recipe, what does that make the chromosome? Probably gave you the answer right there. But with this analogy, I do think of the chromosome as the cookbook. And we all have several pairs of chromosomes, actually 23 pairs. We inherit one of each of those pairs from our mom and another one from our dad. So that's why they come in pairs. So those chromosomes as a cookbooks, and we all have this set of chromosomes that I think of as the whole bookshelf. So I will give you some more resources at the end, at least one helpful link that talks more about chromosomes and DNA and what genes are, and where you can read more or look more at pictures to understand these definitions. And maybe you've come across some of this in your biology classes. But again, really, if you just sort of have that working definition of a gene, you should be pretty good for the rest of my talk. And there won't be any quizzes. So this slide does show one thing that I do want to emphasize, which is that our genes are actually only 1% of all of that chemical squiggly code of our DNA. So that other 99% is not genes. It probably does something. It's not recipes. The genes are the recipes. I can continue with our analogy and talk about how that not genes, that other stuff in our DNA is probably something like the white space in a cookbook that helps make reading recipes easier and more organized. But again, only 1% is actually genes. And genes are important in a concept called evolution. So I just wanted to touch on this. We can think of evolution as a process through which these genes, these recipes change over a long period of time. So not over any individual's lifetime, but over many, many generations and thousands of years. As a result of this process, we can see lots of different structures in nature that have all sorts of interesting functions. So these things are hands, they can serve many purposes, they have many functions, and I can think of a lot more, but maybe you can think of some interesting structures that either you or maybe a pet has that has kind of a unique function. So I'll give you a second to think about that as well. And again, feel free to share if anything comes up. But maybe one other thing I like to think about are my cat's whiskers. So I have a cat, she has whiskers, and the function of her whiskers is to help her feel around in the dark. So that's evolved over time and they serve that particular function. Her parents passed down the genes that help make her whiskers. So evolution is responsible for this diversity of life on our planet over many thousands of years and again, many generations. And it's just how those genes, those recipes change over time. And as a result, another fun fact that I like to think about is that every living thing on this planet has DNA. We all have DNA and genes. And if you go back far enough, we're all related, from trees to fish to humans. In fact, we're related to bananas. I found this fun article that you can click on to learn more, but we actually share some of the same genes with bananas. So maybe you can think of something that we have in common with a banana tree. Maybe not how we look. We don't really look like banana trees, but you might be able to come up with something. And I think one of the big things that they touch on in the article that I've linked to in this slide, but it's just that there are, or rather both us humans and banana trees need to break down the food we take in, banana trees through the roots and the sunlight, and us through the food that we eat. We need to be able to take that food and make it into energy in order to do the things we need to do. And there are genes or recipes that allow us to do that. And bananas and humans share some of those really kind of basic function genes. That's kind of cool. So now that we've briefly discussed the broad picture of genetics and evolution, we're going to zoom back in. Now that we're all using Zoom, no pun intended, but we're going to zoom back in on humans. So human traits, these are characteristics is another way to think of them. There's the characteristics that we inherit from our parents. I'll get to some examples in a second, but they are encoded in our genes. If you think of it, again, that recipe, and the trait is what results from the recipe. So almost always, more than probably 99% of the time, our traits are passed down from our parents. But sometimes that combination of genes from mom and genes from dad results in a new combination or a slight, maybe a variation of a trait so that we don't have the exact same eye color, which is one example, or hair color that our parents have. It's, again, that combination, but it did come from our parents. That said, we are also all mutants. So that's the fun fact for this slide, which means that every single one of us has a few absolutely unique changes in that long DNA code that we didn't actually inherit from our moms or our dads. So yeah. So we're all mutants, but I will say those changes are typically in that not gene part of our DNA. So it's in that other 99% and doesn't actually impact our traits. So yeah, our parents are mutants, we're all just mutants. So let's go ahead and talk about some of these human traits, which some things are pretty common. So typically we share traits with other humans, even if we're not closely related. Going back far enough, we're all related. But some examples that maybe you don't necessarily think of are whether if any of you sneeze when it's sunny out. You go outside, the sun blasts in your face, and suddenly you just need to sneeze. That's actually a genetic trait. My husband does that, and I do not. So that's one example. Another is dimples. So there are genes that actually help with the development of the muscles in our mouth, and there can be slight differences in those muscles. And so some people have dimples and some people do not. So maybe smile at the person next to you and see whether or not you both have dimples. And if you want to share in the chat, feel free. Maybe you'll find some other people who share some traits with you. The last example that I had today is actually something called attached earlobes, which is a more rare trait, but there's still plenty of people who have it. I don't know if you can kind of see my ears. I do not have attached earlobes. This is the more common unattached, where your lobes do not, they kind of free hang down versus being attached to your face or neck. So that's maybe something that makes you a little bit more unique if you have those. But again, there's plenty of other people who also share that trait. And then on this slide, I did have a couple more words to talk about that will help us understand the picture that's about to pop up. And those are the word genotype. And that you can see the word gene is in there. And that just means the genetic code for the trait. So the literal recipe, the letters that are impacting what the trait is. Versus the phenotype, which I won't talk about where that word comes from right now, but you can look that up later if you want. But the phenotype is what the trait actually looks like. So the phenotype for me is unattached earlobes, and I do not sneeze in the sun. That's my phenotype. So there is a tool that helps us think about genotypes and possible phenotypes, and that's something called a Punnett square. You will almost definitely see these in your biology class if you have not seen them already. So I just wanted to show one really briefly here, where we see the parents are on the side. So the blue letters represent each parent. So maybe dad's on top with the big A and the little a, that's his genotype. And then mom's going down the side with these blue little a's. And so we can see the possible genotype combinations that might happen for this particular set of parents. And we can play around and put in different genotypes for the parents and see what combinations their children might have. In this particular case, I will just point out that all 4 different combinations that result here are the same as one of the parents. So these potentially the kids of these parents for this particular trait, maybe we'll call it the achuism, which is that sneezing in the sun. They're either going to have achuism with this big A, or they're not with the two little A's. And if they have it, they're like dad. And if they don't, they're like mom. And that kind of brings me to my next slide, which is just talking a little bit about different inheritance patterns. So these are just a couple pictures showing a couple of different ways that traits can be passed down. The first is dominant and the second is recessive. So the achuism, the sneezing in the sunlight, that is a dominant trait where if you have, you inherit one copy from mom and one copy from dad. But if you inherit the copy that causes achuism, you're going to have achuism. You're going to sneeze in the sun. And so you can see that purple box. It's called a mutation in this particular picture. We tend to think of them not as mutations anymore, but something that's passed down. Whoever inherits that purple box from dad, these two children underneath, they're also going to sneeze in the sun. But if they don't have that purple one, then they're not going to. And then on the recessive side, you actually have neither parent has the trait. So this is like actually the attached earlobes, but they are both carriers for it. So you see that the purple box is colored in, but one is not enough to actually have the trait. You have to have two purple boxes in order to have attached earlobes. So there's only one combination that would result in that. And side note, there is another word on this slide called autosomal. That's right at the top of both of those. Does anyone know what autosomal means or want to take a guess? Maybe say it out loud. And if you don't know, I would not necessarily expect you to at all. But all it really means is that the genes that are passed down in these ways are not on the X or Y sex chromosomes. So the X and Y typically determine whether someone is a boy or a girl. So somebody can have two X's or they can have an X and a Y. There's actually other combinations that can happen too. But because of that trickiness with the Y chromosome and whether or not you have two X's versus one X, there's some other ways that things can be passed down. So autosomal just means that it's not those tricky ways. So it's a fancy scientific way of saying it. There are also many other types of inheritance, and one of the resources I'll share with you has more if you want to really dig into it. But these are the big ones that you'll learn about in science if you haven't already, in biology. So next, I do want to talk a little bit about genetics and our health. The genes we inherit from our parents sometimes play an important role in our health. And these scientists are learning more every day about how combinations of genotypes. So again, you can think of health as sort of a subset of traits. Our health is, some diseases can actually be a trait. But scientists are learning more every day about how some combinations of genotypes, so different genes all working together, might make us more or less likely to have some medical conditions. So this very simple image shows that while there are some rare diseases that are caused by genes alone, things like cystic fibrosis or something called phenylketonuria or PKU, these are very rare conditions and you may never have heard of them. And maybe you have heard of other rare genetic conditions. 1 in 10 people actually does have a rare genetic condition. So maybe one of us here on the call has something. But generally, they're not as common as other things like asthma or diabetes. So I'll get to those in a second. But first, on the other side of this Venn diagram, we've got the environment. Things where, like infectious disease, like the common cold, things that we have to catch or that are caused by germs in the environment or caused by toxins like a poison ivy plant that we just touch causes a reaction. So those are things that are not really impacted by our genes. They're just from the environment directly. But many things in our health are actually a combination of both our environment and our genetics. So common chronic health conditions can be impacted by both sides of this Venn diagram. That's what this circle is called with the overlapping bits. So coming back to those chronic diseases like asthma and diabetes, for instance, I have asthma and neither of my parents, my dad, my mom do not have asthma, but other people in my family do. And that's what we often see with families where these conditions run, where sometimes multiple family members have them. And so as we're learning more, we understand that it's combination of some of our genetics and some of the things in our environment that probably lead to these health conditions. And that said, it can be scary and sort of negative to think about all of these diseases and scary things in the world. So I do want to also mention that, and this is actually part of my job as a genetic counselor too, is to help people understand that our genetics and the environment also work in really good protective ways. So there are many ways that our genes are helping protect us from genetic conditions or some of these chronic conditions. So there are also genes that help prevent asthma and make our lungs work better. And there's also things in the environment and ways that we can live our lives that we can control. We can't control everything, but there are some things we can do that actually help protect us. And things like public health in the United States, which maybe we're hearing a lot about, ways to keep us as safe as possible. So we all just do the best we can. And there are lots of good ways to do that. Some examples might be eating your vegetables, getting enough sleep. So those are ways to control your environment. So another big part of my job as a genetic counselor is helping people who may be at risk for those rare genetic diseases, though. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And we do that by helping people understand their family histories and their own symptoms. So these rare genetic diseases are traits, and they tend to have very clear characteristics. So for example, cystic fibrosis, people have problems with their lungs and how they digest food. Those things are actually connected. And so those specific symptoms can lead somebody to get a diagnosis of cystic fibrosis. And then they can sometimes talk to a genetic counselor to learn more about their genetic diagnosis, and sometimes to get testing to either help confirm it, figure out exactly what's going on, or to try to rule something out. So that's where most of my work is in helping people understand testing options and understand their family history and what their risks might be. And basically, it's kind of the perfect job for someone who loves the science of genetics and also likes helping people and spending time with people. There's lots of jobs in healthcare that allow you to do those things, but genetic counseling is a great fit if you like genetics and like people. Yeah. So I did want to give a few examples of family histories. So as a genetic counselor, I actually draw out family histories. They're called pedigrees, these pictures that I draw, based on what my patients tell me. So I'm going to provide a resource that will help you potentially draw out a pedigree like this too, or rather a program that will help draw it out for you. It is a little clunky, but I'll get back to that. But you don't have to draw out a picture, but you can see how they might be helpful. And I apologize that these are a little bit small, but what I want you to take away from this slide is just that we can draw these pictures, and all of the different symbols and lines have meanings that help us understand what's going on in a family. So the first one, the biggest one here, is actually Oprah Winfrey's pedigree. It's a simple one. She is there right in the middle, and with the red, there's an arrow pointing at her. She's a circle because she identifies as a woman. And she has had a health condition called hypothyroidism. That is not one of those rare genetic diseases. This is a pretty common and often chronic condition. But she has that diagnosis, so we're going to use the color red to mark that. And then we can see her parents here. We can see that her dad is still living and her mom passed away a few years ago. And then she has some siblings that she shares through her mom. So they have a different dad contributing some of their genetics, so they don't share that side of the family with Oprah. But still, knowing Oprah has had hypothyroidism is information that might be helpful for her dad and her sister, because we don't know which side of the family it may have come from, so that they can talk to their healthcare providers about that. The next one to the right, that littler one, that's actually Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, who passed away a few years ago. He had a rare type of cancer. So he's colored in with red to denote that he had that cancer. But one interesting thing about his pedigree is that he was adopted. So we don't know a lot about his biological parents, the people he shares his genes with. He was raised by his who he considers his parents, and that's the really important thing, but they don't share genes, so we can't get a lot of health information from them. So that's what we can see in that pedigree. And then his health information would be important for his family members to know. And we see his kids down there. And the last pedigree I have, we don't see any colored in boxes. This is a very healthy family, and it happens to be Jennifer Lopez's family. And she is a middle child, so we can see her right in the middle there. And one thing that I wanted to point out here is that she has twins, and so we have a way of showing that her son and daughter are the same age, and they are indeed twins, and that's what that different line shows. And since she doesn't have any health conditions running in her family, we just would talk to her about general risks for various health conditions. We all have those, again, just because of those complicated combinations of genetics and our environment. But her family seems to have a lot of protective factors. I know I've read a lot about what J-Lo eats and does for exercise. So she's doing everything she can. So one thing I will mention here, before I go into my last slide, is that if you do want to learn more about genetic counselors and what we do, I'm happy to stick around and answer questions at the end of this too. And I do have a web link for learning more about genetic counseling. So let's go to that last slide for my resources. And I just want to, before I clarify those, I just want to thank you again for hanging out with me today. It's been great chatting with you about this topic that I really like so much. And I will say, we talked a lot about genetics, about sort of these major areas, whether it's in healthcare, human health, or evolution, and just the science of genetics. One thing I did not touch on a lot is the history of genetics, which I do want to acknowledge has a history of some problems for sure with different groups of people. And if anyone has any questions about that or wants to talk more, I can also provide resources on that. But I want to acknowledge that that history is there, and that's really important for us to continue to build off of. If you have heard of the story of Henrietta Lacks, I think probably most people in the DC area may have heard of her, and how her cells and her DNA were such an impact on science. And what we know about genes actually came from her cells, and it was just wrong how her and her family were treated. So I want to acknowledge that history, and that's just one huge example, but one of unfortunately many examples that I want to acknowledge. So that was kind of a serious but really important note at the end. I do want to just talk through my list of resources here for you now to bring us back sort of full circle. The first link that I have here is actually a fun experiment that you can do at home using bananas, which we mentioned we share some genes with. So you can actually do some extraction and actually see DNA by working with bananas, just with some things you might have at home. So the way to do this experiment is on this link. There's a helpful video. You might need to collect some of the ingredients and might need some help doing that, but you can try it out, or you can just watch the video because it's pretty cool to see what she does. There's also some great resources for evolution from Berkeley, which is a college out west. And they've got some great resources for people of all ages, various grade levels, and then just general information about evolution. And then for Punnett Squares, there is actually an app that you can download if you have an iOS device, if you want to play around with those Punnett Squares, that comes from the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. That's a pretty famous laboratory that does a lot of education as well as research in various science domains. But you can download that app. There's also plenty of tools on the internet. If you're able to just do a Google search for Punnett Squares and want to play around with those, I would recommend that. Genetics Home Reference is a resource where you can see those pictures of chromosomes and genes and the different inheritance patterns. This is a great resource that's actually from the National Library of Medicine and NIH. So you can put in genetic conditions and things. So that's what that one is. And then that family history tool that I mentioned from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, they have a tool that lets you put in family history. And one thing I want to quickly mention there is that if you don't know your family history, that's okay. that happens to lots of people. And those conversations can be hard, but the CDC tool not only has some ways for you to put that information in, and they don't save it or anything, it's for your own use. They can print out, but you can print out a nice picture or that list. So they have that tool, and also some ways to potentially talk about your families to try to learn more about your family health history. And then last but not least is the link for more information on genetic counseling. So that's there. I think I'll share my slides in some way and hopefully get them to anyone who is interested. Maybe upload them to Google Drive or something as a link that you can download so that you can actually click on these links. But that's it. Thanks again for being with me today. It's been really great, again, talking about this topic that's I think is so interesting and so important and really impacts us whether we're thinking about it or not. So I'll end there. I'll hang out for a few minutes and see if there has been any questions or anything that come up in the chat. Thanks again.